All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Envision New Mexico this morning. My name is Zach Johnson. I'm Telehealth Coordinator here at Envision. We just have a few items to go over before we get started. First things first, we are being recorded, so please do not disclose any confidential information, patient information, things like that. Also, if you are not talking, please keep yourself on mute so we don't hear any ruffling papers or clicking keyboards, anything like that. If you wish to receive certificates for CMEs or CEUs, what we're going to do is we're going to do a roll call, and you can either announce yourself verbally over the phone or type your full name and where you're from in the chat box, and then you will, towards the, I believe, the beginning of each month, we send those out. And if you'd like to join over video and audio, you can see those little icons at the bottom of your screen. One looks like a little video camera, one looks like an old-timey microphone. And if you do have video, we'd love to see you. And these are our disclosure and accreditation statements. We also have reimbursement opportunities through Molina and Blue Cross Blue Shield. All right, so who would like to announce themselves over the phone? Anybody? Can everybody hear us?
Always our shy folks. Maybe we go around the room, Zach.
All right, sounds good. Well, again, my name is Zach. I'm the telehealth coordinator here at Envision New Mexico. We'll introduce ourselves.
Kevin Whirling, systems analyst for Envision New Mexico.
I'm Sarah Roddy. I'm a second-year pediatric resident through
Welcome.
UNM. Thank you.
My name is Maya Trujillo. I'm a quality improvement specialist here at UNM.
I'm Jane Beckley. I'm a nurse practitioner working with the Fronteras Project at Envision New Mexico.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Emma. I'm an MSW student here at Envision New Mexico.
Good morning. I'm Carol Conley. I'm your facilitator for this semester of Adolescent Health Initiative. I would like to take a moment to introduce Dr. Jeannie Dalen. Dr. Dalen is a clinical research psychologist. Her expertise in health psychology and behavioral medicine research is informed by over 13 years' experience conducting both research and clinical work with chronic illness populations, including obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. She is devoted to developing a comprehensive research program for obesity and metabolic disorders in pediatric populations. In addition, she works in both a clinical and research capacity with family-based adolescent treatment programs for depression and substance abuse, factors affecting the informed consent process for families considering adolescent and child participation in biomedical clinical trials, and the use of web-based technologies and social networking to improve population research literacy in adolescent obesity and diabetes research. Dr. Dalen also is a private clinical psychologist. So if any of us need extra help, she'll be glad to help us. Thank you so much for coming today, and we look forward to your talk.
Absolutely. Welcome, everyone. Good morning. It's nice to be back at Envision and giving a talk on a topic that's near and dear to my heart, which is the use of mindfulness and mindful eating in adolescent populations. And particularly this morning, what I'd like to go over for you guys is just an introduction to think about using mindful eating skills for use in a clinic setting. Morning, thank you for everyone for joining us online. And I do see a couple of familiar names, but many of you are brand new. So this is a great opportunity to really think about how we look at adolescent eating behavior in our clinics. And hopefully this morning I can give you guys some different ways of thinking about how we work with adolescents around eating behavior. So what I'd like to go over today is really like why mindful eating. And what we're going to actually talk about is something called subthreshold disordered eating behaviors, which I'm going to go into detail here in a few minutes about why those are important and why mindful eating approach is a good way to approach disordered eating behaviors, and talking about how the external influences in our environment and automatic pilot is a real issues that really affect our eating behavior in families and especially adolescents. So we're going to talk a little bit also about what is mindful eating. And what I'd like to also offer you guys today is a couple of screening questionnaires that you guys can use in your clinic to actually screen for disordered eating behaviors. And I think I'm kind of stuck again.
Sorry, I can't.
Sorry. And then I'd also like to provide one tool that you can actually use with adolescents in your clinic, which is a mindful eating exercise that we call the Hunger Scout. So that'll be it for today. And of course, we'll have plenty of time for questions or comments at the end. So just a question for you to think about as we kick off this morning is, how many adolescents do you see in your practice that you think may exhibit disordered eating? And I actually start without a definition because I'm curious for folks to see from you guys what you would consider disordered eating without an actual definition. Does anyone have an idea or a thought about what comes to mind for disordered eating and what you see in your practice with adolescents? And I know our AHI folks are always shy. So either as we go through this talk, kind of think about that for yourself, and then also through the chat box, feel free to give comments as well. Carol mentions overeating when not hungry. Excellent example of disordered eating, absolutely. So what we think about with disordered eating is that there's actually sub-threshold clinical indicators that we're looking for. Now, I know many of us in clinical practice, we're trained to actually look for the clinical eating disorders, the ones that we're all familiar with, which is typically bulimia, anorexia nervosa. But actually what we're finding, especially within the obesity and overweight research, is that there's more likely sub-threshold clinical indicators that show that people who are overweight or obese actually are active in these behaviors over time, and they actually are more correlated with obesity outcomes than actual clinical indicators that we're looking at with disordered eating. There's unhealthy weight control practices. So anyone in your clinic who are taking diet pills, a lot of adolescents report using smoking to curb appetite. And then of course we have the purging behavior that might not make the diagnoses of bulimia, but there's still purging behavior to compensate for overeating. Frequent dieting. Now, this is one that we're going to talk about in more detail, because typically for traditional behavioral health programs, we advocate dietary change, meaning a diet in terms of amount of food going in the body or types of food. But actually what we're finding in the research is that dieting as a behavior change strategy actually is correlated with more weight loss over the long term and with negative psychological factors as well. And so frequent dieting is now becoming something in the literature where it's an important actually sub-threshold clinical indicator that looks at disordered eating. And of course, as Carol mentioned, the overeating, which is emotional binge eating. And I particularly put emotional in this description because binge eating, typically what we're finding, it has an emotional component to it. And we'll talk a little bit more about that too. So, of course, the question was, how many adolescents do you see in your practice? But what we're finding in the overall research is that over 80% of adolescents that meet criteria for either overweight or obesity engage in at least one of these sub-threshold disordered eating behaviors: unhealthy weight control practices, frequent dieting, or emotional binge eating. So what's the significance of this is that sub-threshold disordered eating behaviors are correlated with, obviously in the future, actually developing full clinical eating behaviors disorders. Binge eating disorder, bulimia. Typically anorexia doesn't fall within the category with overweight and obese populations, but it hasn't been unheard of. But what we're really finding is that it's highly correlated with continual weight gain and sustained disordered eating behaviors in young adulthood. What we also are finding is that there's quite a psychological base or psychological mediators that we're finding are kind of connected and correlated with subthreshold disordered eating behaviors. What we're finding in adolescent populations is that there is quite a lot of negative affect, a lot of depression in this population. There's a lot of body dissatisfaction, and what we're finding comes from a lot of emotional dysregulation strategies. And not to go full on into the psychological literature, but they're showing that it's actually experiential avoidance or trying to kind of push away bad experiences and bad emotions and negative experiences that lead to emotional binge eating, the unhealthy weight behaviors, purging, etc. So another interesting fact for us here in New Mexico is that disordered eating behaviors are reported at a higher prevalence by our New Mexico adolescents compared to the national average. And just like many things, there's a disparity piece to this in that many Native Americans and Hispanic adolescents report higher disordered eating behaviors than Caucasians. And at the end, just so you guys know that I will have references to where this information came from. If any of you guys are interested in getting more information on a certain topic. So what does that mean for us as clinical providers? How do we think about disordered eating behaviors, and how does that lead to the frame that we're traditionally taught about behavior change? Because many of us were trained in traditional behavior change strategies related to dietary change and physical activity. I'm kind of stuck. So what we have to remember is that information comes from two sources. There are the external facts, and that's where traditional behavioral health programs and information on dietary patterns and habits can be very important. It is absolutely important to have the external focus on food labels, ingredient lists, the latest nutrition information. But what's lacking right now in traditional behavioral health strategies is that there's a lack of looking at the internal information, meaning inside the individual, we tend to avoid or not look at anything related to what it's like for that individual in terms of hunger for them, fullness, likes and dislikes. And what we're understanding is that both have to work together to make a food choice. Each one provides different information and skills. But the important thing is only the person has access to his or her own internal information. And that's where mindful eating comes from, because what mindfulness as a strategy or as a technique really looks at is the focus on the internal experience. What are the hungers, the fullnesses, the likes, the dislikes, the psychological thoughts and feelings that come around food. And so what it allows us to do is take a look more at the internal information. Mindful eating allows us to notice, sort, and use that information. As we know, each individual is exactly that, an individual. They come from their own background, from their own culture, their own preferences. And traditionally right now, we're doing a one-size-fits-all package about nutrition information that doesn't always fit. And I know that you've probably seen this in your clinic where you're giving a handout to a 15-year-old adolescent about, eating more vegetables and broccoli, and they're just looking at you like you're from outer space. And what's typically happening is they take that, they nod very automatically, and then that paper goes in the trash and goes home, or doesn't go home with them. And so really what we're trying to do is shift the focus from being able to use that external information, that dietary nutrition information, but do it more in an individualized approach that can really influence what that individual, what makes sense for them. So why is just dietary information not always enough? Because we are stacked to the gills with information about what we know about the latest and greatest nutrition information. We do know what works, and I always talk with nutritionists all the time, and they're like, Jeannie, we know what works. We know that if you eat, fruits and vegetables and grains and the whole dietary plan, you are going to be more healthy. We know that if you eat certain types of foods and have physical activity, you're going to lose weight. And so absolutely. But the problem with following dietary advice is that the fact that it's mostly always short-term and goal-oriented, meaning we're doing it to get a certain external behavior, i.e. weight loss. But what's the problem with that is that if we only focus on the outside, the dietary advice, and don't think about the internal motivations or the internal needs, it's imposed on the body from the mind. And so again, we're exacerbating that split that is happening right now in healthcare between the body and mind, where the body actually has a wealth of information to give. But many times we have learned to override those signals, to not pay attention to those signals. And so following dietary advice isn't taking into consideration what actually your body needs at any given moment. It rarely takes the body's needs into account. So what it ends up doing is it ignores completely the thoughts, the feelings, the behaviors, the bodily signals that when we're actually mindfully aware, it actually intelligently guides our eating habits. And there's an author in mindful eating who she talks wonderfully about this idea, like 3-year-olds are the best mindful eaters in the world, and they will absolutely pay attention to what their body needs. The problem is it's not given in terms of dietary advice and that they have a protein and a vegetable and a starch at every single meal. You'll see a 3-year-old really crave like corn one day, and then the next day they'll crave sweet potatoes, and then so on and so forth, and then maybe meat one day. So over the course of the week, they'll get all the nutrients that they need. But over time, we start to learn to ignore those body signals. Eat everything on your plate. Make sure that you have this amount. And so what tends to happen is the advice from the outside world gets imposed on our body, and again, we ignore it. Now, I know when you're not a psychologist, thinking about thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and bodily signals, I sometimes get providers doing this to me like, like that's just messy territory that I do not even want to get into. But actually, people, when it comes to eating behaviors, people actually, if you give them time and actually permission to start thinking about what it is that's going on, you can get a wealth of information to help guide problem-solving behaviors and actually advice or dietary information that can be most helpful for them. So I say, don't be scared to start looking at this. There's another factor that happens, which is called behavioral fatigue. And I think all of us know about that when we've been on a diet or trying to do more physical activity. Again, when it's imposed from the outside and we're trying to reach a goal, we get exhausted trying to work hard to do what it is we're supposed to do. And that's very different from taking just a more internal approach, because that becomes more natural. It becomes more of an internal motivation, and things naturally happen that when you pay attention to what your body actually needs and then can give it what it actually needs, things just fall into place very naturally. And though I won't get into exactly, the research that we've done in the mindful eating program that we developed, we did get significant weight loss, and we talked with all the adolescents afterwards, and that was exactly it. It was like if you looked at their trajectories, it wasn't like this perfect linear change in weight. Some of them went up and then down. Some of them went down right away. And what it showed again was that everyone was kind of on their own trajectory. But once they evened out and was able to pay attention, it's like their body naturally got themselves into a groove where they were paying attention to how much food they needed, what they needed, and actually paid attention to those psychological factors as well. And as I'm talking, you guys feel free to ask questions or comments as we go through this. I know this is a really short, fast injection of mindful eating, so I recognize that this is a lot of information at once. So the nice, fun way to start talking about mindful eating is to talk about mindlessness. And I think is one of the things that we all can recognize in ourselves and the adolescents that we work with. This idea of so much of our life is on automatic pilot, especially when it comes to food. So you guys know the drill, and you know we've all done it, where in the morning you get your newspaper, you pour your cereal, and you're not even really paying attention to what you're eating, and you're eating till it's done. You clean your plate, you keep eating until everyone's done. You're at a dinner party, you finish, what do? You maybe grab another roll, grab seconds. So much of our eating behavior is on automatic pilot. Movies, I mean, over the holidays, I think I went to 5 movies, and I cannot even tell you the amount of popcorn I ended up eating, and was sick afterwards. But the movie, the popcorn, the soda, extra large, because of course we want to get our money's worth. And, again, chatting, anytime that we're eating in a social situation, it's difficult to actually pay attention to what our behavior is actually doing, to actually taste food, and to even notice when we're full. Grab chocolates from the bowl, it's kind of the case of the disappearing food, which I have done before, where I remember working on the mindful eating grant, and I'm there, and it's probably midnight, and of course I have like M&Ms, and literally like eating them until I'm just like, where did my M&Ms go? As I'm actually, writing a mindful eating grant. So I recognize that, all of us have some form of this automatic pilot behavior. And it's kind of fun when I go into the more extensive training on mindful eating. They've shown that, I'll just tell you two examples. One, Cornell University does a lot of this fun research on people's mindless eating behavior. And they had people go to a movie and gave them free popcorn, but they didn't tell them that the popcorn literally was about 2 months old and stale. But because the popcorn was free, people ate it like nobody's business. And so even though they were eating like disgusting stale popcorn, that actually later on they actually said, yeah, that didn't even really taste very good. But again, the external idea that it was free has us engage in behaviors that maybe aren't as paying attention to our body. Another fun one is that they had a never-ending bowl of soup. And so they had this contraction underneath a bowl of soup at a restaurant where they didn't know it, but they were told to keep eating the food until they're full. But the soup kept filling up just very slowly and slowly. And so what they found is for the never ending bowl of soup that people didn't know, they ended up eating like 65% more, because we're used to using the cue that our soup bowl's empty, instead of actually like, oh my gosh, like I'm bursting to the seams here. So again, it just shows to highlight how much we are on automatic pilot and use external signals in our environment to gauge our eating behavior and our consumption amounts. Sorry. Yeah. Also, it's important, especially with our adolescents in New Mexico, that there are even outside influences. So it's not just for ourselves and individually, but there's multi-generational family food cultures. Ethnicity, SES, food preferences, food availability plays a huge role in how families and adolescents think of eating and food. It can lead to powerful messages regarding food. So again, important to clean your plate, taught to feel guilty if we don't eat it all. We somehow worsen the situation of starving children in Africa. The huge cost-efficient portions of processed food. Many of my families in the mindful eating group, would talk about the love of wanting to eat healthier food, but really in their minds thinking that fast food is the more economical way to go about feeding a large family. And again, we work on those thoughts, but and that information and show that actually you can eat healthy for relatively low cost, but it is an issue. And so and you're playing a hard game when it comes to McDonald's, $2 cheeseburgers. Food insecurity was a big theme, and I'm sure you guys have seen it in your clinics, the whole you snooze, you lose kind of thing. And adolescents would talk to us about, like, when a pizza came down, your job was to run down those stairs and grab as many pieces of pizza as you could, because if you were even 5 minutes late, all your siblings had eaten all the pizza and were not sad about it at all. And another family, an adolescent, would talk about how when it came to like stews and stuff that were served family style, he would purposely grab more and more, because again, he was worried that if it was only their one meal of the day, he wanted to get all of it then, there, and now. And so food insecurity has been a big topic. And so again, it just shows us that these are powerful messages. So when you think of all of these, in compare it to, but here's some dietary information how you should eat, you can see how it creates a dichotomy. And so again, not that both of these play a role, but we just haven't given as much attention to more of these internal processes and the messages regarding food. So also, again, powerful invisible habits, things that we don't talk about when we're just talking about dietary advice. Who's actually in charge of food decisions? Many adolescents would say, well, this is all great and good, but grandma's not gonna go to the store and just have carrots, right? We're a Hispanic family, and if there's not enchiladas and beans, like, that's just not gonna happen. The food climate at home, and again, our family doesn't eat that, was always a big message that we got in the feast program. So here's where us as providers need to think about how we approach eating behavior change and the way that we talk to adolescents in our clinic. Nutrition and diet information is necessary. And so I don't want anyone to come away from this talk thinking that it's just the internal processes that are important. We know state-of-the-art research on what we know is good for our body. What is ideal? What are we shooting for? So absolutely, nutrition and diet information needs to be there. We need to be able to gauge and help educate people on what we should be shooting for. Though it's necessary, though, what we're finding is that it rarely by itself leads to long-term behavior change. And what tends to happen is we as providers can unintentionally send negative messages regarding food. You're a bad person because you can't change your eating behavior. And so what we're finding is negative messages regarding food and eating actually can lead to more of the psychological issues that we're seeing in obese and overweight populations. The feelings of guilt, the feelings of body dissatisfaction, increased depression, increased anxiety, increased hopelessness, which in turn we know leads to more sub-threshold disordered eating behaviors, the diet pills, the binge eating, the purging, the emotional binge eating, the frequent dieting. And so what we end up doing is we actually create a negative feedback loop where we're actually increasing the issues that we're trying to control or trying to change. And a lot of the adolescents actually said that they actually thought of their pediatrician as evil. Like, they actually said the term evil because they would get very upset going to pediatricians because it was this information that, you know, I'm not doing well and I'm just a fatso and I can't change. And so and then there's a lot of rebellious behavior. They're going to tell me to eat this. Well, guess what? I'm going to do this instead. And so it tends like we're working against the system sometimes, when instead I feel like these two can really augment each other and work together. So what is it that we're wanting to do? How do we bring in more of these, looking at just the internal processes? Like, thinking a bit more about eating wisdom, right? Designed to kind of step more into the present moment and just become aware of two things. What is our intention surrounding our eating behavior, and actually then paying attention while eating? It's actually just putting awareness on the eating process. And awareness offers information for that individual and for you as a clinician, and it can guide you to find the foods and the eating choices that work best for that particular individual. So I love this quote from Thich Nhat Hanh, which awareness is like the sun. When it shines on things, they are transformed. And I'll tell you, when I first started getting into mindfulness and mindful eating, I honestly wasn't that impressed at first, to be honest. I was like, how does just paying attention to what we do, how is that going to help? I mean, I'm cognitive, I'm a CBT trained, I'm a behavioralist. Like, I feel like, there has to be things that we have to do where the physical activity, the dietary advice is very important. But there's something that happens, and I've seen it transform families and individuals and myself time after time, that when we are aware of something, when we put our attention on something, that wisdom, our own innate wisdom, actually takes over. And all the external influences can kind of slowly recede over time, the more that we are aware and put our attention on it. So I truly I've seen it, and so I've actually now have a much more healthier respect for the fact that if we can just pay a little attention to ourselves and learn to not always be operating just in the external world, but into ourselves, it's amazing that our bodies and our minds know what we need for ourselves. All right, so just as an overview, what we're trying to do is just get people back in touch with their own inner dietitian, inner wisdom. And so what we tend to start to look at is more of those psychological internal processes. The physical triggers, their cognitive triggers, the emotional triggers to eat. Physical, what we're trying to do, and this is the skill I'm going to give you guys today, is just regaining the ability to recognize or respond to just internal cues of hunger. It is amazing how many of my kids and families would be like, I can't even tell you what hunger is, or I only know hunger. So we had people who were either with any internal signal of hunger was got so uncomfortable for them that they would continually eat so they wouldn't feel that. And or kids who would like starve themselves all day and then of course go home and go on a binge eating episode. So again, we're trying to get people back in touch where they can start to feel their hunger cues and respond in the moment. Cognitive, telling ourselves what are good foods versus bad foods, leads to feelings of guilt and depression. And so it's not only what we eat, but it's when we eat, how we eat that we're looking at as well. And then, of course, always looking at that heart hunger, that emotional piece, eating when sad, angry, bored. So with mindful eating, what we're looking at is more of the observing, being in the moment, being fully present, not having TV on or our computers or our newspapers, actually enjoying and savoring. When you're going to eat a piece of chocolate cake, you eat the hell out of that piece of chocolate cake, right? And so you enjoy it in the moment instead of that automatic pilot where we eat things and we don't even remember what it tastes like. And then, of course, the non-judgment. As we know, it can be a very circular process for behavior change. And so to not judge ourselves, to increase those feelings of guilt, that can lead to negative dietary change as well. Like I remember having a gentleman at the VA once that said, he'd feel guilty when he had the 3 pieces of pizza. So it's kind of like, well, might as well just eat the whole thing now. And so we'd end up eating the whole large pizza. So again, when we judge ourselves, we actually can increase the behaviors again that we're trying to change. All right, so just to give you guys, this isn't meant that you're to be mindful eating experts, but just to kind of bring to mind that it's really some of these sub-threshold indicators that I think we take for granted because they're not meeting full clinical eating disorders. So a screener that's used in a lot of clinics all over the country and in a lot of research is just the eating attitudes test. And it's a self-report measure of symptoms and concerns, characteristic of eating disorders for high school and college populations. And the website is on this, that if you're interested to download it, you can. And what it can just give you is it can give you some information, first of all, just to see if anyone that you're concerned about does have a full clinical eating disorder, but it also looks at those sub-threshold disordered eating behaviors that we're looking at: the frequent dieting, the binge eating, and then the unhealthy weight control, the purging, the smoking, the diet pills. So it can be really helpful. And then from there, you can know whether or not you should refer out to get some more help. Another scale, and where kids are able to really talk about very well for themselves, is the emotional eating piece. And because we find that over 80% of kids in this population do exhibit emotional binge eating and these other disordered eating behaviors, it can be helpful for you to kind of gauge that on an instrument and then use that information to talk with them in clinic about different ways to deal with their emotional eating and use more kind of different coping strategies. So the emotional eating scale for children and adolescents, the EESC, just assesses the extent to which an individual eats in response to emotions. And there's, again, the website address where you can download that. And what I found is, because it's a hard conversation to start, that having the scale and then using the scale provides a nice introduction point to start talking with kids. And adolescents, I find, they go there. They will tell you about, yeah, like I eat, and it always starts with, I'm eating when stressed. And then when you start to unpackage stress, you learn that it's more depression, anxiety, guilt, family relationships, all of that. So it can provide you a wealth of information for referrals and or just starting a conversation in clinic about addressing disordered eating. All right. So my little squirrel is how I feel some days when I'm mindlessly eating. What I'd like to share with you guys last is how to work at least on the physical triggers, the physical internal cues related to eating. And what I have found with adolescents, they really like to do this exercise because it's something very practical and visual that they can relate to. So that's why I'm sharing this one with you today. And what it's called is the hunger scale. And it's basically what you would think is that it is a scale that ranges from a 1 to a 10. 1 being where you talk about that, where you're so hungry, like starving, feeling weak, lightheaded, dizzy, that horrible feeling of just being super starved, all the way to the number 10, the Thanksgiving full, and what my kids like to say, the button poppers. So when you're that full, it's just you, and you know how that feels too. We've all been there. So what you have them do is start to get familiar with the scale, because I think what you find is very much people understand the 1s and the 2s. I'm super hungry, and then the holy hell, I'm really stuffed now. Like, how did I get there? And we always have done that in the restaurant, where you get there and you're so hungry, and then at the end you're like, oh my God, why did I eat so much? So that's normal for people to. We have more of a gauge or sense on those extreme ends of the scale. What we don't have as much familiarity with internally is the middle of the scale, that 3 to 7. And so that's what you find why it's in gray. Because when you have people start to think about what that feels like, that's where people kind of scratch their heads and go, I don't really know. Like, I'm not really clear how a 3 is different from a 4, that's different from a 5. And so this gives you a lot of information when you do this for yourself on kind of paying attention to those internal experiences of hunger. So I'm going to give you guys, there's different versions of the scale, and I actually tend to like this one as well, because this is important, I think, especially for our adolescents, is that we're shooting for the balance in the middle. We're shooting for that 0. We don't want to be so super hungry physically or full. We neither want to be hungry or full, because what's important about that is that that's not good for our bodies on either side. And I think kids who are more in the overweight and obese category think, oh gosh, I need to starve myself. Like, that's the only way that I can get, back to where I want to be. And everyone else who's skinny tends to starve themselves. I hear that a lot. And so it's important for us as providers that our message is, No, either one of those extremes is not a healthy state to be in and doesn't get us where we want. What we're shooting for is the middle. So what I'll have them do is I'll either have them, like in our feast program, we were able to do this with them in the room, where we actually gave them the scale and had them have a meal and have them take a couple bites and go through all the mindful eating and then rate their hunger after each bite. And you would see, like, it was super easy at the beginning and really hard for them in the middle. And they would laugh because they realized it was hard for them to know the middle. So you could do it with them in clinic if you have that option, and or just have them take it and do it like at home or with a breakfast or with a meal, a couple meals over the week, and then bring it back and discuss. And again, we're just trying to have them pay attention to the internal signals related to hunger and fullness. This is just a couple different versions, just so you guys had different versions of the scale. This one's kind of colorful, so some of my girl adolescents like that one on top. And then if you're dealing with a younger adolescent population, the peas in a pod are kind of a cute way as well, where instead of numbers, what you're talking about is, how many peas, in your pod, in your stomach. And, as you take a bite, more and more peas get in there. So it's like, okay, I've got enough peas in my pod right now. So that's kind of fun to use with kids who are a little bit younger, or adults like myself who are immature and like to do peas in a pod for herself. Okay, so here again, just gives you guys an idea of questions or a handout that you can give your adolescent client. I have them tell you, what does a 0 feel like for you? Common answers are the headaches, extremely hungry, irritation, shakiness, fatigue. And then what does a 10 feel like when you're as full as you can imagine? Nauseated, bloated, fatigued, swollen, accompanied by those feelings of shame and guilt, right? That's when you're getting into more of the psychological. So again, 0 to 10, it's easy for people. Then what you can have them do is, right now, where are you on a scale from 0 to 10? The fun part then is asking them, what do you notice about your body that made you choose that number? And that's where it gets a little interesting, because if they're somewhere in the middle, that's when it's like, well, I'm not exactly sure. And then that's information for them. And then what I like to do is tell them to keep a journal of his or her hunger rating before, during, and after each meal for 3 days, or when it's adolescents, I'll just say, pick 3 meals this week, something that's doable for them, and have them start to note the actual physical cues that lead to the choice of that rating. Why did you pick that number? What's happening inside that makes you choose that number? And can you actually have them experiment with achieving a different level of fullness? Can they get, how does the client feel 1 hour after achieving a hunger level of a 6 or an 8? So you're really having them use the internal cues instead of all the external that we normally are looking at when we decide how much we're going to eat and when. So that's really it. Starting with the hunger scale, I've learned just starting with that and even doing the emotional eating scale provides the adolescent with a lot of information and just awareness of that. It's not just about what we eat and how, but how are we eating, why we're eating, what's the intention, what's the attention that we're providing, and can really help to kind of strengthen and augment the conversation when we're looking at behavior change with our kiddos. Now, as Carol mentioned, I'm actually in a really nice place in my career where I'm doing private practice as well. And so I just wanted to offer to those of you in the Albuquerque area, if you guys are here, that if you have a clinical referral with an adolescent, whether it's related to disordered eating that you're concerned about, and or especially just mood, the depression, the anxiety, family relationships, I'm your girl. So I put up a slide that just has my information. So if you'd like to contact me about any family or adolescent that you're concerned about, I can definitely look at that. And if I'm not able to help, at least provide referrals to other providers in town. And then just a few references for all the information that we went over in this very fast presentation on mindful eating, if you guys are interested. And that's really all I have for today. I've had a very quiet audience, so either I talked way too much or this was just brilliant. Now you guys don't have any questions, which I doubt. So if you guys have any comments or questions or just...
Sean asked, does Jeannie take Medicaid?
I do. Yes, I do. So good question.
All right, so before we jump off, everybody, just a couple more things. I just put a link to a survey in the chat box. It'll take just literally a couple minutes of your time. That information is really important to us that we have that. So please take the time to do so after this presentation or when you can. Also, just one final opportunity for roll call. I've heard from several of you, but not all of you. If you want to receive CME, CEU credits, thank you, Jennifer. I think, yep. Please announce your full name and your organization in the chat box. And one thing that I kind of skipped over at the beginning was the case consultation reimbursements opportunities. If you're interested in those, please contact myself, Zach Johnson, or my supervisor, Kevin Whirling. And our contact information is at the end of these slides. Right there. And with that, I'm going to leave the meeting open for just a few more minutes. I think Jeannie has to jump off here pretty quickly.
A few more minutes.
But if you have any questions over the phone or in the chat box, please feel free to ask. I'll stop recording so you can discuss any confidential information.
And I do see one question for Sandra.